May 2nd, 1944. Dawn breaks at 4 a.m. over the Romanian countryside near Targul Frumos. In a command post on a hill behind the town, Lieutenant General Hasso Eccard von Manteuffel stands at his observation point, binoculars raised, scanning the horizon to the north. At just 5 feet 2 inches tall and 120 pounds, he cuts an unlikely figure for a Wehrmacht general. But throughout the German army, this small man is known by a name that commands respect, the Panzer Baron. Von Manteuffel has positioned his headquarters perfectly. From this vantage point, he can see the entire sector spread before him like a chessboard. His Grossdeutschland Division, Germany's elite armored formation, occupies prepared defensive positions in a valley below. Beyond them, on the high ground to the north, the Red Army is massing for an attack. Minutes after first light appears, the earth erupts. Soviet artillery unleashes a ferocious barrage. Shells rain down on German positions with thunderous fury. In their foxholes and trenches, Panzer grenadiers claw deeper into the earth, praying that death will pass them by. The bombardment seems endless, but von Manteuffel knows what it means. The ground assault is coming. At around 5:20 a.m., a new sound cuts through the artillery barrage, the deep rumble of hundreds of tank engines. Through the smoke and dust churned up by the bombardment, massive shapes begin to materialize. T-34 medium tanks, and moving with them, something new, something the Germans have been dreading since their reconnaissance patrols first identified it a week ago. The JS-2 Joseph Stalin heavy tank, armed with a monstrous 122mm gun and protected by heavy armor. The JS-2 was designed for one purpose: to destroy German Tigers in head-to-head combat. Von Manteuffel lowers his binoculars. He is prepared for this moment with meticulous care. His defenses are expertly positioned, his troops are veterans, his tanks are held in reserve, ready to strike at precisely the right moment. But as 200 to 250 Soviet tanks surge forward at full speed, even the Panzer Baron wonders if it will be enough. What unfolds over the next 5 days will become one of the most studied defensive battles in military history, a masterclass in combined arms warfare that NATO commanders will analyze well into the 1980s, a battle where Soviet numerical superiority crashes against German tactical brilliance, a battle that will decide the fate of Romania's oil fields and potentially the outcome of the war in southeastern Europe. This is the Battle of Targul Frumos. 3 months earlier, on March 5, 1944, Marshal of the Soviet Union Ivan Stepanovich Konev launched a massive offensive against the German 8th Army northeast of Uman. His second Ukrainian front possessed overwhelming strength, 10 armies, including 3 tank armies, with 650 tanks and self-propelled guns. Konev was 47 years old, a veteran of World War I and the Russian Civil War. He had escaped the massive purges that decimated the Red Army in the 1930s through a combination of political savvy and genuine military talent. Since the German invasion in 1941, he had commanded various fronts, participating in the gigantic Battle of Kursk and liberating multiple Soviet cities. For his role in the encirclement and destruction of German forces in the Korsun-Cherkasy pocket in February 1944, he had been promoted to Marshal of the Soviet Union. Now his forces stood poised to deliver what he hoped would be a knockout blow against German forces in southeastern Europe. The Soviet offensive sliced through thinly held German lines with terrifying ease. When Uman fell on March 9th, Konev ordered his forces to keep going toward the Bug River, giving the retreating Germans no chance to organize a defensive river line. His armies kept up relentless pressure, severing the 8th Army's connection with the 1st Panzer Army. On March 11th, elements of General Bogdanov's 2nd Tank Army crossed the Bug River at Julinka. Within days, Soviet forces reached the Dniester River and established bridgeheads on the western bank. By March 21st, the Soviets had firm control and spread out through the Romanian countryside, meeting little opposition. Then the rains came. By early April, heavy rains had turned the ground and dirt roads into a brown quagmire that virtually stopped Soviet mobile units dead in their tracks. The muddy season had arrived, and with it, a crucial pause in operations. For Adolf Hitler, this meant time. time to stabilize his forces in southeastern Europe, time to protect what mattered most, Romania's Ploiești oil fields. Located about 30 miles north of Bucharest, the Ploiești oil fields were the center of Romania's petroleum industry. Without them, Germany would be hard-pressed to find an alternative fuel source for her industry and her military. The fields were vital to the German war effort. They had to be held. Adolf Hitler was furious at the territory lost in Ukraine and Romania. On March 30th, his personal aircraft arrived at Field Marshal Ewald von Kleist's Army Group A headquarters. With von Kleist aboard, the plane flew to Lvov to pick up Field Marshal Erich von Manstein, commander of Army Group South. The two field marshals had borne the brunt of the Soviet assault. Hitler believed they had failed him. Arriving at Hitler's retreat in Berchtesgaden, both men were awarded the swords to the Knight's Cross. Then Hitler relieved them of their commands. Newly appointed Field Marshal Walter Model replaced von Manstein. Colonel General Ferdinand Schörner took command of what would be renamed Army Group South Ukraine. Before dismissing von Kleist, Hitler told him that the Soviet offensive had run its course and that he was certain the Red Army was exhausted. The Führer also claimed that after German forces threw the expected Allied invasion in France back into the sea, those divisions would be sent east to reclaim lost territory. Von Kleist's response was blunt. The time had come to make peace with Stalin before the eastern armies were totally destroyed. When the new commanders arrived at their headquarters, an order from Hitler dated April 2nd awaited them. The Russian offensive in the south of the eastern front has passed its climax. The Russians have exhausted and divided their forces. The time has now come to bring the Russian advance to a standstill. It was a tall order. Schörner's command stretched from the central Carpathian Mountains to the Black Sea, a line almost 300 miles long. His forces consisted of 2 Romanian armies and 2 German armies, a mixed bag of troops with vastly different capabilities. Hitler's order was explicit: Romanian forces will be disposed in accordance with the terrain so that chiefly German troops occupy the sectors in danger of enemy tank attack. He also ordered the German gun crews man the heavy anti-tank guns distributed to Romanian forces. "Thank God for the mud" was the phrase that passed the lips of generals and privates alike as they struggled to form a cohesive defensive line. But Hitler had been partially right about one thing: the Soviets did have problems. In 3 months, Konev's forces had liberated most of Ukraine, pushing the Germans back 250 to 300 miles. They had simply outrun their supply lines. There was also the matter of replacing heavy troop losses, partially overcome by drafting male peasants from liberated areas, though it would take time to train them. With the onset of the muddy season, Stavka, the Soviet High Command, ordered all front commanders to go over to the defensive. This allowed time to train replacements and move supply depots closer to the front. Stavka was also using this time to build up forces for a massive summer offensive aimed at crushing the center of the German line on the eastern front. To keep German intelligence off guard, Konev and other southern front commanders were ordered to keep their armored forces highly visible and conduct limited attacks. This deception, called active defense, was designed to fool the Germans into believing major offensives would take place in the south. One of those so-called limited attacks would take place around a small Romanian town called Targul Frumos. General Otto Wöhler's 8th Army occupied a pivotal position, guarding the Carpathian passes and providing a link with the 1st Panzer Army. The 49-year-old Wöhler had earned the Knight's Cross for his skill and initiative on the northern sector of the Eastern Front. Since August 1943, he had commanded the 8th Army through a bloody retreat from Ukraine to the Romanian border. On paper, his Army Group Wöhler boasted 30 divisions, but 17 were Romanian units of varying effectiveness. Many German divisions were reduced to little more than battle groups. Wöhler's main striking power resided in his panzer divisions, the 23rd, 24th and 3rd SS Totenkopf, and one unit that stood above all others, Panzer Grenadier Division Grossdeutschland. The Grossdeutschland Division, known as GD, was arguably the premier division of the German army. Its origins lay in pre-war Berlin Guard troops, eventually becoming a Panzer Grenadier Division in April 1943. Unlike other German divisions that drew personnel from particular regions, the GD recruited from all parts of the Greater German Reich. From January to March 1944, the GD had fought several fierce battles around the Ukrainian city of Kirovograd, before retreating west toward the Romanian border. At the end of March, they continued westward, thwarting a Soviet attack aimed at cutting the Jassy-Kishinev rail line. In that action, they destroyed 89 tanks, 10 anti-tank guns, and inflicted heavy losses on Soviet infantry. By mid-April, the division had established a defensive position stretching from Ruginesti, about 12 miles northwest of Targul Frumos, to the Siret River, about 12 miles northeast of the city. The GD remained a superbly equipped unit with high morale. Each of the division's 2 infantry regiments consisted of 3 battalions, each with 4 companies of 100 men and 1 heavy weapons battalion per regiment. There was also a Sturmgeschütz battalion with 35 to 40 assault guns, a combat engineer battalion, and an understrength reconnaissance battalion. The division's formidable armored force was the Panzer Regiment GD, consisting of 4 battalions with approximately 40 tanks each. The regiment included 1 battalion of medium Panzer 4 tanks, 2 battalions of Panzer 5 Panther tanks, and 1 battalion of heavy Panzer 6 Tiger tanks. This massive firepower was backed by an armored artillery regiment and 3 batteries of deadly dual-purpose 88mm guns. Commanding this magnificent division was Lieutenant General Hasso Eccard von Manteuffel, known throughout the Wehrmacht as the Panzer Baron. Von Manteuffel was small in stature, 5 feet 2 inches, 120 pounds, but he had gained a reputation as one of the best panzer commanders in the German army. Born in Potsdam in 1897, he had served in World War I and the post-war Reichswehr. General Heinz Guderian, the father of the panzer divisions, had recognized his potential as a tank commander before the war began. Von Manteuffel had honed his skills commanding a motorcycle battalion, motorized and panzer grenadier regiments, and the famous 7th Panzer Division, Rommel's old unit. He took command of Grossdeutschland on February 1, 1944, just as battles around Kirovograd reached their peak. The Panzer Baron understood defensive warfare at a fundamental level. When he surveyed the terrain around Targul Frumos, he recognized it immediately: excellent tank ground. The terrain the Soviets would need to cross was ideal for swift armored movement, but it was also largely open, giving the Germans an excellent field of fire. He positioned his forces with surgical precision. The Panzer Grenadier and Fusilier regiments would be at the forefront, occupying well-fortified entrenchments covered by anti-tank guns and dug-in assault guns. Hills 192 and 197, located west of the town of Poloceni, gave the Germans excellent observation points to call in artillery fire on Soviet avenues of approach. Hills 254 and 372 provided the same advantage farther west. A second line of defense, bristling with anti-tank weapons and infantry, was constructed about a mile behind the main line of resistance. Most of the powerful Panzer Regiment GD was kept in reserve near Targul Frumos, ready to counterattack any Soviet forces that breached the German line. Von Manteuffel placed his headquarters on a hill behind Targul Frumos, with a perfect view of the entire sector. From this vantage point, the Panzer Baron and his staff would fight the battle with the skill of a maestro conducting a symphony orchestra. While von Manteuffel prepared his defenses, Soviet forces facing the GD had not been idle. Along with training replacements and replenishing supplies, Konev launched a series of probing attacks to keep the Germans off balance. On April 16th, Soviet forces launched a surprise attack on a GD company stationed in the town of Bals, about 9 miles northwest of Targul Frumos. The Soviets took the town but were soon driven back by a swift counterattack. The continuing Soviet probing convinced von Manteuffel that a major enemy effort was imminent in the Targul Frumos sector. His scouting patrols reported a heavy Red Army buildup directly behind the front line. To forestall the inevitable, von Manteuffel ordered a limited attack of his own. On April 25th, 2 Panzer Grenadier battalions attacked Soviet positions near Hill 372. Supported by artillery and Sturmgeschütze, the Panzer Grenadiers surged forward, driving the Russians from their positions and destroying several anti-tank guns and 3 tanks. 2 days later, another German attack uncovered an unpleasant surprise. Among the knocked-out Soviet armor was the new JS-2 Joseph Stalin tank. Armed with a powerful 122mm gun, the Discovery sent shockwaves through the German command. The JS-2 had been designed specifically to counter the Tiger. Its 122mm gun could penetrate a Tiger's frontal armor. Its own armor was thick enough to withstand Tiger fire at most combat ranges. For the first time since the Tiger's introduction in 1942, German tank crews would face an opponent that could match them gun for gun. The Discovery hastened German efforts to strengthen their defenses. Von Manteuffel knew his Tigers and Panthers were excellent tanks, but he also knew that in the coming battle, numerical superiority would belong to the Soviets. Everything would depend on positioning, timing, and the skill of it. The Germans expected the Soviet offensive to begin on May 1st, the holiday of the proletariat. Air reconnaissance reported that tank and infantry concentrations were continuing to build up in front of German lines. But the expected attack failed to materialize. Waiting is the worst part for any soldier. The frontline troops nervously scanned the horizon until the sun set. Some breathed a sigh of relief as they lay in their trenches, trying to catch a few hours of sleep. For others, the night was spent trying to control the tension that had built up during the day. Dawn broke on May 2nd at about 4 a.m. A few minutes after the first rays of light began to show, all hell broke loose. The Soviets unleashed a ferocious artillery barrage. Shells struck German positions with thunderous fury. In their foxholes and trenches, the infantry clawed deeper into the earth, hoping that death would pass them by. The cries of wounded men were heard despite the thunder of bursting shells. Miraculously, most of the German entrenchments received little damage. At around 5:20 a.m., the roar of tank engines signaled the start of the ground assault. Armor from Bogdanov's 2nd Tank Army, supported by infantry from General Trofimenko's 27th Army, rumbled forward. From their firing positions, the Panzer Grenadiers gazed anxiously through the smoke and dust, waiting for the first shadowy appearance of the enemy. Bogdanov's plan called for a massive armored assault of 200 to 250 tanks against Colonel Karl Lorenz's Panzer Grenadier Regiment GD. To keep the Germans off guard, other armored infantry attacks hit the junctions between Lorenz's regiment and Colonel Horst Niemac's Fusilier Regiment GD, which was defending the German right flank. T-34 medium tanks and JS-2s fired point-blank at Panzer Grenadier positions as they thundered forward. Advancing through a valley between Ruginesti and Hill 372, they hit the German line at full speed. The Germans fired with everything they had, but they were no match for the steel monsters racing toward them. Most of the veteran soldiers had seen this scenario repeated over and over again as Soviet material superiority increased in the east. When the Russian tanks were almost upon them, the men in the front-line positions crouched deeper into their foxholes, letting the Soviet armor roll directly over their positions. It took immense courage to let a 57-ton monster like the JS-2 run over your foxhole. Some of the Panzer Grenadiers lost their nerve and broke, jumping up and running. Some were cut down by machine gun fire. Others were crushed to death by the steel treads of Russian tanks. The 1st Battalion of the Panzer Grenadier Regiment was particularly hard hit. As Soviet tanks passed, the Panzer Grenadiers struggled to get their firing positions back in order, but Red Army infantry was already upon them. It was time to disengage, and several units began moving back to secondary defensive positions. Many made it, but 1st Company, commanded by Lieutenant Bernhagen, had waited too long. "Move back, boys!" the lieutenant cried as wave after wave of Soviet infantry appeared out of the smoke. Many of the men, seeing it was too late, turned to face the Soviets. Most fired at the advancing enemy until they were cut down. Others raised their hands in surrender, but to no avail. War on the Eastern Front was a brutal affair, and prisoners were not at the top of either side's priorities during battle. The surrendering men of 1st Company soon joined their comrades, staring at the sky through unseeing eyes. Meanwhile, the Soviet tanks had outpaced their infantry support. Infantrymen who had been riding on the backs of tanks were swept off by machine gun and rifle fire. The advancing armor was now on its own. Suddenly, concealed German anti-tank guns opened fire. Tank after tank exploded as murderous 75mm and 88mm shells struck home. The tanks continued rolling toward Targul Frumos, despite the casualties. German Sturmgeschütze joined the battle, also firing from concealed positions. First Lieutenant Dietrich Diekmann's first company particularly distinguished itself, knocking out several of the lumbering giants as they made their desperate thrust toward their objective. After running the gauntlet of anti-tank and assault gunfire, 10 Russian T-34s ran straight into the assembly area of Colonel Willy Langkeit's Panzer Regiment. Both sides were taken by surprise, but the German gunners reacted faster. Within seconds, the 10 tanks were blazing steel infernos. There were no German losses. Seeing the plight of their comrades, several of the slower JS-2s stopped and began firing at the panzers at distances of up to 1.5 miles. Von Manteuffel happened to be at Langkeit's headquarters when the shelling started. At first, both commanders thought they had come under friendly fire, but they quickly realized they were up against the new Soviet heavy tanks. Von Manteuffel immediately sent word to Major Herbert Giller's 3rd Tiger Battalion, ordering a company of heavy German tanks to engage the enemy. The duel between Tigers and JS-2s began. At long range, both tanks were formidable. The JS-2's 122mm gun could penetrate a Tiger's frontal armor. The Tiger's 88mm gun could do the same to the JS-2. It became a question of who saw whom first, who fired first, and whose gunner was more skilled. While the Tigers and JS-2s exchanged fire at long range, a company of faster, more maneuverable Panzer IVs used limited cover in the area to advance to within 3,000 feet of the Soviets. As shells from their 75mm guns began to hit home, the remaining Soviet tanks retreated, leaving several burned-out hulks in their wake. Approximately 250 Soviet tanks had been destroyed in the area between Targul Frumos and the front line of the Panzer Grenadier Regiment GD. German losses, a mere handful of tanks. It was an outstanding victory, but the battle was not over yet. In Colonel Niemac's Fusilier sector, the Soviets were also in the midst of a combined assault. Niemac's Fusiliers, like the Panzer Grenadiers on their left, let Russian tanks roll over them before popping up to engage the accompanying infantry. The Soviet armor continued to advance without its infantry support and soon reached Niemac's command headquarters. Gathering his staff around him, Niemac ordered an attack at close quarters. With hollow charges, sticky mines, and bundles of grenades, the Germans knocked out tank after tank. The regimental staff, fighting alongside combat engineers and anyone who could hold a weapon, systematically destroyed 24 enemy tanks in brutal hand-to-hand fighting. It was desperate, chaotic combat. Men ran up to moving tanks and slapped magnetic mines on their hulls. Others threw bundles of stick grenades into open hatches. Tank crews who bailed out were shot or bayoneted. The regiment's headquarters became a killing ground where staff officers fought like infantrymen. A second Soviet attack at around 11 a.m. succeeded in breaching the Fusiliers' line in several places. But once again, Soviet infantry was prevented from following its armor. Seeing the danger from advancing Soviet tanks, Colonel Langkeit ordered most of his Panzer Regiment to turn and attack the marauding Soviets. By noon, another 30 enemy armored vehicles lay burning on the Romanian countryside. German bombers joined the fray. Most devastating of all were Colonel Hans-Ulrich Rudel's famous tank-busting Ju-87 Stuka dive bombers. Rudel, who would become the most decorated German serviceman of the war, led his squadron with deadly precision. Thoroughly disoriented, the few remaining mobile Soviet tanks fled, leaving the battlefield to the Germans. The Stukas also hit several Soviet artillery positions, destroying guns that had pounded the Germans only hours earlier. During the night of May 2nd, Langkeit moved some companies of Panthers and Tigers closer to the front line, where they could directly support the entrenched infantry. Anti-tank guns were also redeployed, so Soviet artillery could not immediately zero in on them. The repositioning proved crucial. The following day, May 3rd, saw a renewed Soviet assault on both the Panzer Grenadiers and the Fusiliers. This time, as Soviet tanks breached the infantry positions, they were met with a devastating hail of steel from the recently deployed Tigers, Panthers, and anti-tank weapons. German gunners fired round after round at the advancing Soviets, halting the attack and forcing surviving tanks to once again beat a hasty retreat. Try as they might, the tankers of the 2nd Tank Army and the infantry of the 35th Rifle Corps could not break through to Targul Frumos. Although they had pushed the German line back in some places, the toll taken by 2 days of continuous battle began to show. It was the same for the Germans. As night fell on May 3rd, Exhausted infantry fell back into their foxholes, wondering how much longer they could hold out against the seemingly endless number of tanks and men the Soviets were throwing against them. Some companies were down to platoon size. Although the Panzer Regiment had barely been touched, it was up to the worn-out infantry to keep the line stable. On May 4th, the Soviets changed their tactics. Instead of advancing on a broad front, they concentrated their forces on a few select points. After blasting the breakthrough sectors with everything from mortars to rockets, they moved forward, hoping to obliterate everything in their path. The fighting was particularly fierce around Hill 256, just southeast of Kikinesti, where Soviet and German infantry battled for control of an excellent observation point that commanded the entire sector. Hand grenades, flamethrowers, and razor-sharp entrenching tools were the weapons of the day as each side fought to eject the other from the strategic position. In another sector, Captain Meyer, commanding the 2nd Battalion of the Panzer Grenadier Regiment, led a counterattack aimed at retaking the village of JS-2, which had fallen to the Soviets on May 2nd. In the hand-to-hand fighting that followed, Meyer was wounded, but his ad hoc assault group succeeded in driving the Soviets out of the village. Except for the battle for Hill 256, the German line had been fairly well stabilized by the evening of May 4th. On May 7th, a counterattack by Nimax Fusiliers, supported by Panthers and assault guns, finally drove the Soviets off Hill 256. The battle for Targul Frumos was over. The Soviets had given their all, but the path to Targul Frumos and the Plosti oil fields beyond had not been opened. For the next few months at least, the Red Army threat in Romania was over. Von Manteuffel and his division had won a monumental defensive victory. During the first 3 days of battle, German forces destroyed more than 350 Soviet tanks, with another 200 damaged. The Grossdeutschland Division lost a total of 10 tanks permanently destroyed. The statistics were almost unbelievable: 350 to 10, a kill ratio of 35 to 1. Even accounting for the advantages of defensive positions, the disparity was stunning. How had they done it? How had a single German division, albeit an elite one, stopped an entire Soviet tank army? The answer lay in multiple factors working in harmony. Von Manteufel's brilliant positioning of his forces, the layered defense that channeled Soviet attacks into killing zones, the courage of infantry who let multi-ton tanks roll over their positions before engaging Soviet infantry, the tactical flexibility that allowed rapid redeployment of reserves, the combined arms integration of infantry, armor, artillery, and air power, but perhaps most importantly, it was the quality of the troops themselves, veterans who had been training and fighting together for years, men who understood their weapons, their tactics, and each other, soldiers who could improvise under pressure and execute complex maneuvers under fire. As von Manteuffel himself would reflect years after the war, in spite of the most careful preparations, the decisive factor in defense was the combat potential of the troops. It was this which allowed the defense to achieve the results it did. A huge fiasco for the Russians. Although Soviet post-war accounts barely mention the battle, Targul Frumos had significant implications. The failed offensive meant the Plosti oil fields remained in German hands for several more months. This was crucial, as Germany's war economy depended heavily on Romanian petroleum. But Konev's limited offensive had never been intended to capture Plosti on its own. It was part of Stavka's deception plan to keep German forces and attention focused on the southern sector while the real blow was being prepared farther north. In that sense, the offensive succeeded, even as the tactical battle was lost. The massive Soviet summer offensive, Operation Bagration, would begin in late June against Army Group Center, 500 miles to the north. That offensive would destroy an entire German army group and liberate Belarus. By comparison, the defeat at Targul Frumos was a minor setback. But for the German defenders, it was a stunning victory that proved superior tactics and troop quality could still overcome Soviet numerical superiority. For NATO commanders during the Cold War, it became a textbook case of how to conduct a mobile defense against Soviet armored assault. The battle demonstrated key principles: defend in depth, not in a linear fashion. Keep mobile reserves to counterattack penetrations. Use terrain to channel enemy advances into kill zones. Integrate all arms, infantry, armor, artillery, and air power into a seamless defensive system. Above all, trust in well-trained troops to execute complex plans under the stress of combat. The battle also marked the first major engagement between the JS-2 and the Tiger. Both tanks proved formidable. The JS-2's 122mm gun could penetrate a Tiger's frontal armor at combat ranges. The Tiger's 88mm gun could do the same to the JS-2. Both tanks had thick armor that could withstand hits from medium tanks. But the JS-2 had weaknesses that German tankers exploited. Its rate of fire was slow. The 122mm gun used two-piece ammunition that took longer to load. Its optics and gun sights were inferior to German equipment. And most critically, at Targul Frumos, its crews were inexperienced. The Tiger, by contrast, was operated by veteran crews who had been fighting for years. German optics were superior, training was superior, and the Tigers were supported by Panthers and Panzerbaron in coordinated attacks, while JS-2s often found themselves fighting alone after their infantry support was stripped away. The battle proved that in tank warfare, as in all combat, the crew matters more than the machine. A superior tank operated by a poor crew will lose to an inferior tank operated by experts. The JS-2 was potentially capable of defeating the Tiger, but at Targul Frumos, German experience and tactics prevailed. For the Soviet forces, the defeat was costly and demoralizing. The Second Tank Army had lost more than half its armor in just a few days of fighting. Infantry casualties were severe, with entire battalions reduced to company strength or wiped out entirely. The 35th Rifle Corps had been mauled, but the Red Army could replace its losses. Factories in the Urals were producing thousands of tanks. The Soviet Union's massive population provided endless replacements for infantry divisions. By summer, the Second Tank Army would be rebuilt and ready for new operations. For the Germans, the victory bought time, but not hope. They had won the battle, but they were losing the war. Romania would fall to the Soviets in August 1944, and with it, the Ploesti oil fields. The Grossdeutschland Division would fight on, but the tide of Soviet advance could not be stopped permanently. Von Manteuffel would go on to greater commands, eventually leading the 5th Panzer Army in the Battle of the Bulge in December 1944. He would survive the war and live until 1978, always regarded as one of Germany's finest panzer commanders. Today, the fields around Targul Frumos are peaceful. The town itself is quiet, its strategic importance long forgotten by all except military historians. Few traces remain of the battle that raged there in May 1944, but in military academies, the battle is still studied. NATO commanders in the 1980s examined it closely, looking for lessons on how to defend against Soviet armored offensives. The principles demonstrated by von Manteuffel, mobile defense, combined arms integration, the importance of training and experience, remained relevant decades later. The battle demonstrated that technology alone does not win wars. The JS-2 was theoretically capable of defeating German heavy tanks. Soviet forces had numerical superiority in tanks, artillery, and infantry. They had momentum after months of successful offensives, but they did not have von Manteuffel's tactical genius. They did not have the Grossdeutschland Division's veteran troops. They did not have the Germans' experience in coordinated defensive operations. In the end, the battle came down to the same factors that have decided warfare throughout history: leadership, training, morale, and tactical skill. The side that possessed these qualities in greater measure won, regardless of numerical inferiority. May 1944, Targul Frumos, Romania, a small town where the Red Army's advance was halted, where German defenders proved that skill and preparation could overcome numbers, where the Tiger met the Stalin and emerged victorious, where the Panzer Baron orchestrated his masterpiece. The war would continue for another year, but at Targul Frumos, in those blood-soaked fields of Romania, the Germans demonstrated that they were far from beaten, that even in retreat, even outnumbered, they remained one of history's most formidable fighting forces. The lesson was not lost on the Soviets. When they returned to Romania 3 months later, they would do so with overwhelming force, careful planning, and no room for the kind of tactical brilliance that had defeated them at Targul Frumos. This time, there would be no miracle. This time, the sheer weight of Soviet power would prevail. But for 5 days in May 1944, the Panzer Baron and his Grossdeutschland Division achieved something extraordinary. They stopped the unstoppable. They defeated the unbeatable. They proved that in war,